Dear friend, pause for a moment and allow yourself to become still. Take a slow breath and be fully present, because I believe there is a reason these words have found you today. This isn't simply another message passing through your screen. It arrives at a moment when your heart needs encouragement, perspective, and truth. Even if nothing around you appears to be changing, something meaningful is already taking place beneath the surface. Not every transformation announces itself with dramatic signs. Some of the greatest shifts happen quietly, long before anyone can recognize them. While you may not see immediate results, God is working in ways that go far beyond what your eyes can perceive. There came a point when you chose to stop forcing what was never meant to depend entirely on your effort. You stopped chasing someone who had become comfortable receiving your love, attention, and care without offering the same commitment in return. You didn't create conflict. You didn't plead for understanding or try to prove your worth one last time. Instead, you stepped back with dignity. That decision carried far more power than you may realize. The person who always expected your messages, your kindness, and your emotional presence is now experiencing something unfamiliar. The steady support they relied on is no longer there. Instead of arguments or dramatic endings, they are facing silence. Sometimes, silence reveals more than words ever could, because it leaves room for reflection. Without your constant effort holding everything together, they are beginning to experience the relationship from an entirely different perspective. For the first time, they must sit with questions they previously avoided. They no longer have your energy filling every empty space or making every difficult moment easier. When only one person is carrying a relationship, the other rarely has to examine their own heart. They can delay decisions, avoid accountability, and remain comfortable because someone else continues investing enough for both people. But that isn't the kind of relationship God desires. Healthy love requires two willing hearts, not one person doing all the work while the other simply benefits. The moment you stepped back, the balance began to change. Not because you were trying to manipulate anyone, but because you removed yourself from a pattern that had become unhealthy. What once felt secure to them now feels uncertain, and uncertainty often forces people to confront truths they have ignored. Scripture reminds us in Proverbs 4:23 to guard our hearts above everything else, because our lives flow from them. Choosing to protect your heart was not selfish, it was wisdom. As you honored that principle, God began revealing what had been hidden all along. He started exposing the true condition of the relationship, the reality of the other person's heart, and the direction he has been leading you toward. Before your silence, they rarely questioned your presence because they assumed it would always be there. They responded whenever it suited them and pulled away whenever they wanted, believing your patience would bridge every distance. That consistency became something they expected rather than appreciated. Now everything feels different. Without your familiar presence, they are becoming aware of what they once overlooked. Human nature often takes constant blessings for granted until they disappear. What was once ordinary suddenly becomes noticeable when it is no longer available. Your silence isn't about punishment or strategy. It's about allowing space for reality to speak. The expectations they once carried have been interrupted, and that interruption has opened the door for honest reflection. Whether they admit it or not, they are replaying conversations in their mind. Small moments that once seemed insignificant now carry new meaning. They may be wondering whether you've changed, or whether they failed to recognize your value while they still had the opportunity. At first, this isn't simply about missing you. It's about realizing that something they assumed would always remain has changed. God often uses these moments to awaken hearts that have grown comfortable or distracted. As 1 Corinthians 14:33 reminds us, God is not the source of confusion, but of peace. The uncertainty they now feel is the natural result of an imbalance that existed for too long. Yet through your decision to step back, God is making room for truth to rise to the surface. Sometimes, His quiet work accomplishes what endless explanations never could. If your goal is to create a new script for your own channel that conveys the same underlying ideas in a genuinely fresh way, here's an original version. Dear friend, there is something happening beneath the surface that deserves your attention. The change taking place isn't only affecting the relationship, it is revealing truths that could not be seen while you were carrying everything alone. For a long time, you invested more than your share. You reached out first, kept conversations alive, made room for understanding, and carried the emotional weight of the connection. Because you were constantly filling every gap, it became difficult for either of you to recognize just how uneven things had become. Your effort kept the relationship moving, even when the commitment was no longer equal. Once you stepped back, everything changed. Without your constant presence holding things together, the imbalance could no longer remain hidden. Now the relationship asks something of them that it never demanded before. It requires initiative. It requires intentional effort. It asks them to decide whether they are willing to invest instead of simply receiving. That shift can be uncomfortable for someone who has grown accustomed to being pursued. Continuous attention often becomes a quiet source of reassurance. When that reassurance suddenly disappears, questions naturally begin to surface. They may wonder whether they misunderstood your commitment, whether they overlooked your value, or whether they assumed your presence would always be there, regardless of how little they contributed. Psalm 37:23 reminds us that the Lord directs the steps of those who seek Him. Choosing peace over pursuit was not an accident. It was a step guided by wisdom. Sometimes God asks us to release what we have been trying to control, so that truth can finally come into the light. Your silence becomes a tool for discernment in several important ways. First, it exposes whether the relationship was truly balanced. As long as you were doing most of the work, it was easy to overlook how much depended on your effort alone. Once you stepped back, both of you gained a clearer picture of who had really been sustaining the connection. That realization isn't meant to shame anyone. It creates the honesty that genuine healing requires. Second, silence creates space for reflection. Constant communication leaves little room for honest self-examination. When everything becomes quiet, people are often confronted with thoughts and emotions they have been avoiding. In that stillness, they may begin recognizing what they truly feel, not only about you, but also about themselves and the choices they have made. Conviction can be uncomfortable, but it often becomes the beginning of meaningful personal growth. Third, your silence reveals who is willing to take responsibility. Previously, you were always the one closing the distance whenever it appeared. Now the opportunity belongs to them. Whether they choose to reach out, remain passive, or walk away tells you far more than promises ever could. When someone sincerely values a relationship, their actions eventually reflect that truth. They may not respond perfectly or immediately, but genuine care has a way of expressing itself through consistent effort. Fourth, this season reveals emotional and spiritual maturity. Not everyone responds to absence in the same way. A mature person is willing to face uncomfortable emotions honestly. Instead of protecting their pride, they examine their own behavior, accept responsibility where necessary, and remain open to growth. Someone who lacks that maturity may distance themselves even further, minimize the importance of the relationship, or simply wait for you to return to old patterns so they never have to change. Their response is not simply information about them, it is guidance for you. It shows whether they are prepared to build the kind of relationship founded on mutual effort, humility, and genuine commitment. God often allows silence to reveal what constant striving could never uncover. When the noise fades, truth has room to speak, and that truth becomes one of the greatest gifts He can give to a searching heart. If your goal is to create a new script for your own channel that communicates similar themes in a genuinely original way, here's a fresh continuation. The fifth truth revealed through your silence is the reality of their heart. When you were constantly reaching out, encouraging the connection and keeping it alive, it was difficult to separate their true feelings from the comfort of your consistent presence. Your effort may have been supporting emotions that had never been tested on their own. Once you stepped back, that support disappeared. What remains is no longer influenced by your constant attention. It becomes a clearer picture of what they genuinely feel when nothing is being provided for them. If their care for you runs deep, distance often brings that realization into sharper focus. They begin to miss not just the conversations or the routine, but the unique person who brought peace, encouragement, and consistency into their life. They recognize qualities they overlooked while they still had easy access to them. If, however, their attachment depended mostly on convenience or familiarity, that reality also becomes clear. Although that truth may be painful, it is still a blessing. Living with clarity is far healthier than remaining trapped inside false hope. God never asks us to build our future on uncertainty when He desires something stronger for us. The sixth truth is one that often goes unnoticed because it happens within your own heart. Your silence is not only creating space for the other person to reflect, it is creating space for God to work inside you. For so long, your thoughts may have been consumed by wondering what they felt, what they meant, or what they might do next. That constant emotional effort leaves little room for peace. As you release the need to carry the relationship alone, your energy begins returning to where it belongs. Instead of being spent trying to convince someone to value you, it becomes available for healing, wisdom, and renewed strength. God uses that quiet season to restore what prolonged disappointment has slowly worn down. Isaiah 30:15 reminds us that strength is found in quietness and trust. Sometimes the greatest evidence of faith is not striving harder, but resting confidently in God's direction. What once felt like emptiness gradually becomes a place where discernment grows and your heart becomes healthier than it has been in a long time. The seventh truth is perhaps the most freeing of all. Silence reveals whether the relationship has a future that is built on mutual commitment or whether it has been held together by one person's determination alone. If the connection truly reflects God's purpose, it will not depend forever on your constant pursuit. Healthy love finds ways to move toward one another. If it was never meant to become a lasting covenant, your decision to step back allows that reality to reveal itself naturally. There is no need for endless arguments or repeated attempts to force answers. Truth eventually stands on its own. A closed door should never be viewed as proof that God has abandoned you. More often, it is evidence that He is protecting you from settling for less than His best. Every ending creates space for a beginning you cannot yet see. As your pursuit ends, the other person often enters a season of uncertainty, even if they appear perfectly calm on the outside. Their outward composure does not always reflect what is happening within. The first emotion they commonly experience is confusion. They had grown familiar with the pattern of your presence. Whether they fully appreciated it or not, your consistency became part of their emotional routine. When that pattern suddenly changes, they naturally begin asking questions. They wonder why things feel different. They replay past conversations. They consider whether something changed in you or whether they failed to recognize something important while it was right in front of them. Those unanswered questions can linger much longer than they expected. What happens after that depends less on the situation itself and more on the condition of their own heart. Your silence simply creates the opportunity. Whether that opportunity leads to humility, growth, avoidance, or continued distance depends on their emotional and spiritual readiness. In the end, their response reveals far more about their character than your pursuit ever could. If your goal is to create an original script for your own channel that explores the same themes from a fresh perspective, here's a new continuation that conveys similar ideas without following the original's expression or organization. Someone who has developed emotional and spiritual maturity responds to distance very differently from someone who is driven mainly by pride or fear. Instead of reacting immediately, they allow themselves time to reflect. They become willing to ask difficult questions, not only about what happened between the two of you, but about their own choices and responsibilities. Rather than searching for someone to blame, they honestly consider whether they showed up with consistency, communicated openly, and invested in the relationship as deeply as they expected the other person to do. That kind of reflection creates humility. It shifts the focus from what they might lose to what they may have failed to nurture while the opportunity was still in front of them. When that realization is genuine, actions usually follow. A person who sincerely values a relationship doesn't rely only on emotions or good intentions. They become willing to demonstrate that value through meaningful effort. Their response grows out of conviction instead of panic. At the same time, there is something equally important for you to remember. Many people assume that once they release control and place the situation in God's hands, everything will change overnight. They expect immediate answers, quick reconciliation, or an obvious sign that everything is moving in the right direction. But God often works through seasons rather than sudden moments. Think about how growth happens throughout creation. Seeds remain hidden beneath the soil long before anyone sees evidence of life above the surface. Yet important work is taking place where no one can observe it. In much the same way, God is often accomplishing his greatest work in places our eyes cannot yet reach. A quiet season should never be mistaken for an inactive one. While you wait, God may be softening hearts, exposing unhealthy patterns, strengthening your character, and preparing circumstances that are not yet visible. At the same time, he is restoring your peace, renewing your confidence, and teaching you to find your security in him instead of in another person's choices. The book of Habakkuk reminds us that God's purposes unfold at the appointed time. What he has planned is never delayed, even when it feels slower than we would prefer. His timing is not governed by our anxiety or impatience, but by his perfect wisdom. That is why this season calls for trust instead of striving. There may be moments when you're tempted to reach out one more time, simply to relieve the uncertainty. You may feel the urge to explain yourself again, or convince someone to see your value. In those moments, remember the promise found in Proverbs 3:5-6. We are encouraged to trust the Lord wholeheartedly, instead of depending only on our own understanding, believing that he is able to direct every step as we acknowledge him. One of the greatest battles many people fight is not with another person, but within their own heart. It is the quiet fear that letting go of someone means letting go of their only chance to experience real love. It is the voice that whispers late at night, asking, "What if this was the best relationship I was ever going to have? What if no one else ever chooses me? What if I walk away now and spend the rest of my life wondering if I made the biggest mistake of all?" Those thoughts can feel incredibly real because they speak directly to our deepest desire for love, belonging, and security. They often become louder during seasons of silence, especially when we no longer have constant communication to distract us from our emotions. When the relationship becomes quiet, our fears often become noisy. But beloved, just because a thought feels convincing does not mean it is telling you the truth. Fear has a way of presenting itself as wisdom. It tells you that holding on is being faithful, when in reality it may simply be keeping you trapped. It convinces you that chasing one more time is an act of love, when it may actually be an act of desperation. It encourages you to settle for uncertainty because the unknown feels more frightening than remaining in something familiar, even if that familiar place has been hurting you for a long time. God never intended fear to become the foundation upon which you build your future. When fear makes your decisions, it causes you to compromise your peace. It tempts you to lower your standards, silence your needs, and accept relationships that require you to constantly prove your value. Over time, you begin measuring your worth by someone else's willingness to stay, instead of by the unchanging love God already has for you. That is never the life your Heavenly Father desires for His children. God's plans are never limited by one relationship, one opportunity, or one person's decision. We often think in terms of scarcity. We convince ourselves that blessings are rare, and that if one door closes, nothing else will ever open. But God operates from abundance, not scarcity. His ability to bless your life is not dependent upon one individual making the right choice. If someone walks away from what God intended them to value, that does not mean God's plan for your life has failed. It simply means God is fully capable of accomplishing His purpose through another path. His promises have never depended on another person's consistency. They depend on His faithfulness, and His faithfulness never changes. This is why waiting on God requires trust instead of control. There will be moments when everything inside you wants immediate answers. You may feel tempted to send another message, explain your heart once more, or search for signs that the other person is finally changing. Those moments are understandable because uncertainty is uncomfortable. Human nature wants closure, it wants certainty, it wants reassurance. Yet God often teaches us the deepest lessons while we are learning to trust Him without having every answer. The silence you are experiencing is not necessarily evidence that God has forgotten you. Sometimes, it is the very place where He is preparing you. While you are waiting, He is strengthening your character. He is healing wounds you may not even realize you still carry. He is teaching you that your identity does not depend on another person's approval, but on His unchanging love for you. Jesus reminds us in John 10:10 that the enemy comes only to steal, kill, and destroy. One of the enemy's greatest strategies is not always obvious temptation. Sometimes it is quiet discouragement. Sometimes it is convincing you that God will not come through for you. Sometimes it is filling your mind with fear until you begin making decisions simply to escape loneliness rather than to pursue God's best. When fear replaces faith, people often settle for relationships that were never meant to become permanent. They remain in situations where love is inconsistent, communication is unclear, and effort is one-sided, because they believe having something imperfect is better than having nothing at all. But God's love teaches a different lesson. His love reminds you that being alone for a season is far healthier than remaining in a relationship that continually drains your spirit. A season of waiting is not wasted when it is spent growing closer to Him. In fact, many of God's greatest preparations happen in seasons where nothing seems to be happening at all. Zephaniah 3:17 paints a beautiful picture of God's heart toward His people. It tells us that the Lord is with us. He is mighty to save. He delights in us. He quiets us with His love and rejoices over us with singing. Think about that for a moment. The Creator of heaven and earth does not merely tolerate your presence. He delights in you. He is not impatient with your waiting. He is not disappointed because you feel discouraged. He draws near to strengthen you when you feel weak. He remains faithful when your emotions fluctuate. His love stays constant even when everything around you feels uncertain. That truth changes everything. When you truly believe that God delights in you, you no longer chase people because you fear being abandoned. You begin choosing relationships from a place of confidence rather than insecurity. You stop trying to convince others to recognize your worth because you already know where your worth comes from. Your future is not hanging by the thread of one person's decision. It rests securely in the hands of a faithful God who sees every detail of your journey. He knows what you need long before you ask. He knows which doors should remain open and which ones must close for your protection. So if you find yourself in a season of waiting, do not lose heart. Continue trusting His timing, even when you cannot yet see the outcome. Continue walking in faith, even when your emotions tell you to panic. Continue believing that what God has prepared for you will never be taken away by someone else's unwillingness to choose you. The love God has planned for your life will never require you to abandon your peace, your dignity, or your faith. His plans are always rooted in wisdom, guided by perfect timing and established through his unfailing love. Hold on to that promise, because the God who called you is faithful, and he always finishes what he begins.